and early stimulation programs, including brain builders. The ministry welcomes that attention because we know the earliest years of a child's life are crucial to long-term learning and development. Programs like brain builders are not simply ideas on paper. They form part of a wider support system involving parental support, early stimulation, early childhood intervention. Moving towards forward, the ministry is prepared to continue working closely with UNICEF, CAPRI, the Ministry of Health and Wellness, the Ministry of Labor and Social Security, and other partners to strengthen the continuum of support for children from birth onwards. Another important issue raised in the report is the challenge of budget visibility and tracking. And this is an area where the ministry agrees improvement is needed. Sometimes government programs are not easily visible in public budgets because funding is organized by program categories and administrative structures than by specific beneficiary group. That does not necessarily mean programs are absent or inactive, but we accept that better child-focused reporting should help improve transparency, accountability, and public understanding. And so the ministry is prepared to work in these three practical areas going forward. First, improve child-focused reporting within the education budget. Second, strengthen public's reporting on outputs and outcomes in areas such as special ed, early childhood development, school nutrition, and learning recovery. And third, collaborate with the Ministry of Finance, the Planning Institute of Jamaica, UNICEF, and other partners to strengthen the child-focused expenditure tracking across government. Ladies and gentlemen, reports such as this plays an important role in informing policy decision, strengthening partnerships, strengthening planning, supporting continuous improvement within the sector. The ministry welcomes constructive review and analysis as accountability and transparency remain essential to national development. At the same time, it's important that assessments are balanced, evidence-based, and considered within the broader national context. Jamaica has continued to make significant investment in its children, particularly through the education sector. Our task now is to ensure that these investments becomes more visible, more targeted, more measurable, and ultimately more effective in improving the outcomes for our young children. And to the students here today, I leave with you this thought. Every discussion about educational policy, every budget decision, every reform initiative, all of it ultimately about creating better opportunities for you and for the generation coming behind you. I thank you very much, and I wish you a productive and meaningful launch session. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Carr, for bringing that response on behalf of the Ministry of Education, Skills, Youth and Information. And we thank you so very much for being here. And we know that the conversation will continue beyond today. That's the whole idea of these kinds of discussions and this kind of research, ladies and gentlemen, because the change will not take place in this room, but it's what we'll do beyond here. And when we'll look at the recommendations and conversations about how we can make the changes recommended, or looking at how each representative and in their own spaces can make changes, then that's how we're going to make a difference. So we are going to be having our panel discussion. And a reminder to you, ladies and gentlemen, that wherever you are, you can send us questions via our Slido. That's SLIDO. So go ahead, and once you get there, the code is for every child. So once you enter that, you'll be able to access and send your questions. And already we're seeing a few questions coming in. So we look forward to getting those questions answered by our panelists. And of course, Dr. Thorburn will be back on stage to take a few of those questions. And she'll be joined by Mr. Andre Miller from UNICEF. And of course, once again, the UNICEF team, very integral in ensuring that this report was done, and they commissioned Capri because of how important this discussion and this report overall is for ensuring that we leave no one behind. And of course, that's a tagline linked to our Global Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, leaving no one behind. And we can look at quality education and ensuring that we leave no one behind by ensuring that all the finances trickle down in the right ways. And we're going to be having a bit more of a discussion on that. So of course, ladies and gentlemen, I see a couple more questions coming in. And of course, keep the conversation going online as well. There are a number of people who are not in this room, but they need to see and hear about what's taking place here today. So go ahead and ensure that you tag Capri online, and of course UNICEF online as well at various social media platforms to ensure that we have the conversation going beyond this evening. So I'm going to ask my panelists to join me, and I'm asking you to put your hands together for them as well. For clarity. All right, so one of the very important things, or one of the first questions I wanted to ventilate, because I got asked, what's this gap that's being referred to in the title of this report? So Dr. Thorburn, perhaps I'll start with you. I mean, the gap between public spending and child outcomes in Jamaica, what would you say is that gap that we're looking at?
So it's what we're putting in and what we're getting out, and we're not getting out commensurate with what we're putting in. And this is why this whole idea of not having a headline number is such a key aspect of thinking about the findings of the report. It doesn't matter if we're putting in $10 or $100. If we're not getting $10 worth of an outcome or $100 worth of an outcome, then it doesn't matter how much it is. So it is trying to understand what is happening between the input of the money and the output of the human worker, citizen, member of the labor force, not even the child, the person who is going to be the part of Jamaica that's going to keep Jamaica going forward. That's where that gap is.
And of course, the conversation beyond now will tell us that it's not a concern about spending or allocation of resources, in the sense that from a headline budgetary standpoint, Jamaica is in fact spending a lot on education, but it's a number of intricate things. For instance, how do we outline in the budget where this money is going? How can we track that from a transparency and governance standpoint? But let me bring you in, Andre. I mean, why is it important for us to do studies like this? I mean, of course, we know that UNICEF is big on ensuring that our children are, catered for, and when we look at the Convention of the Rights of the Child, but why do we need to be looking at this kind of data, this kind of research?
Yeah, thank you. I think we're at a very seminal moment for Jamaica as a country. We are just a few years yet from our reflection on the 2030 Development Plan, as well as the SDGs.
Right, all right, sustainable development goals.
And that's important for us to note, because a budget signals a country's priority. And for children, they often do not have the opportunity to lobby on their own behalf. And so they need adults to speak up for them, to advocate for them, to put before the decision makers critical realities that they face. And so this moment, this study gives us an opportunity to pause. And what is beautiful about it is that it confirms that yes, Jamaica has spent and is spending billions on children, but it's now time to turn the corner and to begin to look at how do we now monitor what's really happening, and how do we ensure that all our children are receiving the critical support that we are providing for them? How do we ensure that coverage reaches all children? And as is the tagline for UNICEF, we are here for every child. We leave no child behind. As it is right now, if we don't monitor, there is the likelihood that we're leaving some children behind. And so this study causes us to pause, to reflect, and to put in place some very low-cost and low-hanging actions that can cause us to really bring more children into the safety net.
I will reinforce some of those low-hanging actionable items a little later on in the discussion. But one of the things, anytime I speak to researchers, I always like to ask
because there's always that idea that you may go into that research with a thought or an expectation of what the possible outcomes could be. So I'm going to come to you, Dr. Thorburn, with that question shortly, but I wanted to ask you, were you surprised by anything in particular, Andre, when you saw the findings of this research?
The evidence shows commitment. It also shows that this commitment is repeated year after year after year.
So there's no doubt that we are keen on investing in our children.
Exactly. However, the allocations and expenditures are not always visible. And so that's where we have to now take the conversation. We know that we're a child-friendly nation. We now have to look at how do we tangibly demonstrate that we're a child-friendly nation, and that is in our budget.
But for somebody who may be listening or watching and maybe wondering, but why does it need to be visible? If it is that the money is there and it's being allocated, why does it need to be visible?
As was said earlier in the presentation, if it's not seen, it's not done. And that's the truth. And because children, and I made the comment, because children don't vote, they are often not deemed a constituent of the broader constituency. And so their voices gets lost in the thick of the noise in the marketplace. But the truth is, they are the investment for the future. The country has to begin to look at the capital outlay now, or the significant capital outlay later. And I put it to the country that if UNICEF says if you make that investment today, you're likely to spend less tomorrow.
Absolutely, because one of the there are a couple of things that stood out for me in processing this research, but the first 1,000 days, the most consequential in any child's life. And those first 1,000 days, if the right investment isn't made, as an adult, that child is likely to see about a 25% drop in their potential economic earning.
Yeah, so the evidence for that is actually phenomenal, and it was done right here in Jamaica, and we detailed this in the report itself. But there's been a remarkable longitudinal study of Jamaican children. I think that cohort is about 35 now, and they were able to show very clearly in very rigorous research with extremely high integrity that the children who received stimulation, and the stimulation was they trained the mothers of these babies to play with their babies. They trained the mothers to look their babies in the eye and talk to them. That was the stimulation. Those children grew up to have fewer criminal issues. They stayed longer in school, they had better employment outcomes, they had better health, physical as well. There was a nutritional component to the intervention. They earned 25% more than the control group, which did not receive the intervention, meaning their mothers did not get trained to play with them as babies. So yes, the data is very clear that those first 1,000 days have a tangible output that we can actually count. And that was done right here in Jamaica. So it's not even something we can say, oh, that's an imported thing that happens elsewhere. And that research has been taken from here and put into policy and programs all around the world.
Jamaica leading as always, but very interesting findings there. But let me bring it back to my original question about what did you expect to find, and did it match up with what you actually found in your research?
Yeah, so Capri's been doing research on children since 2018 we first started with the UNICEF situation analysis of children in Jamaica report. It was the first research we had ever done, and many people think of Capri as an organization that does research on children, but it started there. Every single report we have done since then came out of that original situation analysis. And then I wear other hats as well in child protection outside of Capri. So I was pretty certain that the research was just going to support my preconceived notion that we don't spend enough. And so I was happily, it's always nice as a researcher to find something you didn't expect. And I actually was surprised by the finding we spend more than I realized. I wasn't surprised that we're not accounting for it. But what it said to me was that we have the money, we're spending the money. We're not short of money to spend on children. As I said, we're not a rich country yet, but we have more resources than we have ever had. and we have a stated commitment to children. And it's not, we talk about children are the future, they don't have votes and so on, but we're also really we're talking about the country that we are all a part of. It's not just that children are cute and they're vulnerable. I mean, this is nation building. So there's a developmental question as well, a development question, not just about children. We're talking about the country that we're building and that we're creating.
So, I mean, there are a number of recommendations, 5 particularly, and we're going to get to them shortly. But for you, Andre, I mean, UNICEF has always been keen on ensuring that you have a real sense of, one, what's happening with our children, and of course, finding solutions to ensuring that we leave none of our children behind. So from this report, there are a number of potential low-hanging fruits, but what would you say, in your view, would be maybe a top 1 or 2 that could potentially be accelerated so we could see potentially some movements towards those recommendations being realized?
Yeah. So we need to get to the stage, as is the case in other countries, Guatemala and Argentina. We need to know where the money is going. Yeah? We need to follow where the money is going so that we can know whether or not our coverage is increasing. We also need to know the adequacy of that spend. So one of the things that UNICEF is recommending out of this analysis is that we begin a process of tagging the budget. And what is really tagging the budget? Is putting in place a code that looks at critical deprivations that children experience. So say, for example, you want to know how many children have been vaccinated. Not only would you want to know how many have been vaccinated, but you want to know where those children are located, how many in rural Jamaica. You want to know how many boys, how many girls. You want to know how many children with disabilities. So disaggregating the data by some critical domains that allows us to know to what extent we are reaching the children where they are, so that when the next fiscal cycle comes, because Jamaica has an excellent fiscal responsibility framework, we now have to move that framework to the point of not just establishing procedures, but we need to move the framework to the point of being able to monitor how effective we are at executing that framework. So tagging the budget allows us to be able to know who the money is reaching, and also whether the resources are adequate, and if we need to increase or adjust as the case may be. As we would have found in the public expenditure review we conducted with the World Bank some years ago, it pretty much said Jamaica is spending well on education, 5% of GDP. That's great. When you compare that in the region, we're doing well. When you compare it to OECD countries, we're doing well. However, we need to look a little bit more at the data. The data is saying to us that we're not spending as much on early childhood education, where there is a higher return on investment for the country in comparison to other levels of education. Not saying we should stop, but we need to look at where it matters most and where do we get value for money, stronger value for money.
Absolutely. Now, Dr. Thorburn, one of our audience members they've sent in a question, and they're asking, and it's linked to what you're saying now. Are there any examples where targeted spending has produced meaningful improvements for children?
Mm-hmm. The one that comes most to mind, so in the report, we looked at, I think it was 40 different commitments that we could trace, that the commitment was made, and we could identify a budget line for, or some line of expenditure for, and the extent to which it was completed. And there were 4 fully aligned commitments that were made. And one of them was the Ramps in Schools program, where the Ministry of Education had committed to making schools more accessible to special needs children. And they had set a target of how many ramps in how many schools, and they met that target. It was allocated for and it was delivered. And what was characteristic of all of the commitments that were aligned, so all the commitments that were fulfilled, was that they had dedicated numerical targets dedicated budget lines and accountability frameworks. That was the common thing. Even though these 4 commitments were all different across different times and across different sectors, that was the common feature of the 4 fulfilled or aligned commitments. So that would be one of them. There weren't, as I said, it was 4 out of, I think, 40, if I remember correctly. So most of them are only partially aligned, a few are unaligned. There was one category that almost was what we called reversed, where government had gone back on its spending, which is in the allocation for foster care, children who are in foster care. When we looked at real allocations over the period, over the review period, the real allocation to foster care has gone down quite dramatically between 2017, 2018, 2024, 2025, 2026. And that is extremely troubling for so many reasons. One is there's a stated commitment to deinstitutionalization, meaning to placing children more in family environments than in children's homes. Yet the amount that is being spent is going down. We also know that the cost of a child in a family, in a foster care placement, is about 10% of the cost of a child in a children's home. So it is mind-boggling that more children are not being placed in family placements, that we're continuing to put children in children's homes at such a high cost with such poor conditions in the homes. So that is kind of the reverse example of where targeted spending achieved. This is something that we have identified is spending is decreasing, the real spending is decreasing, and this is on a stated commitment. So there's so many concerns about that particular line. And that's actually a line in the budget. That is actually a line in the budget of how much is allocated to foster care. So we were able to trace that just through looking in the estimates. And you can see the decrease in the real spend on children in foster care.
Andre, when we look at the fact that Jamaica is at a place where we're below replacement rate, roughly, and the conversations now, and you said it in your findings, Dr. Thorburn, that every dollar spent now is even more critical because we have fewer children, which means that the investment in each child is absolutely important for us to see a return on that investment. So I wanted to ask you, Andre, I mean, when you look at that reality, how critical is it for us to move now to make these changes? And it's not necessarily changes per se, because as also shared in the report, a number of them are low-hanging fruits. But how would we, based on what you're seeing, UNICEF has seen across the region, and based on this report, how much of a threat would you say is inaction based on the findings of this report?
Which is where I'll start. The cost of inaction is far greater than the cost of action. Jamaica already has the framework to be able to institute a lot of these recommendations, and there are not many recommendations. It's 5. Very low-hanging fruits. Within this fiscal year, the budget call comes in September. We can sit together. The Ministry of Finance is at the table. We have had conversations with the Ministry of Education present, Labour and Social Security, and so we believe that the first starting point is let's look at the indicators. Let's look at the indicators that are aligned to children's development and well-being. And let us see how we can begin to code those in the budget so that by the end of the next fiscal year, we can make some more concrete statements about the expenditure. That's 1. 2, I do believe that Jamaica has significant goodwill, and when we look at the lay of the land within the region, UNICEF has been a partner of choice for the government of Jamaica when it comes down to children's well-being, and that's not my gospel. It was said by Dr. King earlier, and as such, we stand toe-to-toe ready to support the government with technical assistance within the region. We're a multi-country office come next year, which means that we're bringing far greater technical boots on the ground to support not just Jamaica, but the region to move on this in a collective manner. It's a homogeneous conversation, a homogeneous topic that affects not just Jamaica. And so Jamaica can lead, because what is good about this, Javon, is that Jamaica has led in so many areas in development of children. We're seeing it in terms of the expenditure for PATH, direct cash transfers. It's a proven area where funds go directly to children. We're seeing it in relation to the school feeding program, where funds directly hit children, or not hit children, where funds directly impact children, yes, hit their accounts. We're also seeing it in the use of universal access policy for health, where children go to the hospitals, at no cost to them and their families. And so if we look at how we can collaborate, if we look at our indicators, if we look at coding in the budget, it becomes, these are critical key entry points that allows us to move the needle and on this issue over the next 12 months, dare I say.
So I'm sure when people read the report, they'll not have this question, but it was very clear to me that a lot of the actions required, Dr. Thorburn, don't necessarily require much expenditure at all to get done. So how would you respond to that? Because someone might be watching, Lord, it's going to cost a whole heap of money if you put in them something every way I talk about.
So yes and no. Many of the changes, Andre mentioned that we already have several frameworks in public expenditure that can be extended to cover child-related expenditure. Institutional capacity issues, that is something that exists across the board in all sectors.
Could you delve a little bit more in
yeah, so what I'm saying is that, and this is reflected in some ways in the compensation ratios, that we are spending a great deal on the delivery of the services. Dr. Reed said, teachers are the service. They are. But there's also a lot that needs to be done, what you might say, in the back office, that is not the teachers, that impacts what the delivery of the education service, the quality of the delivery of the education service. So, for example, mental health. We need more guidance counselors. We need more child guidance clinics. Why don't we have those? In some of the answer to that question is we don't have enough mental health professionals literally in Jamaica. So we have a capacity deficit to deliver some of these kind of side or not peripheral, but adjacent services to children that would make the investment in education. So we talked about, the investment in education. Yes, we are spending a great deal, but if that investment is not reaching a child who is prepared to receive all of that investment, if they have not had that first 1,000 days, or even if they are already in school and they're coming to school from a home where it is not meeting their developmental needs, the capacity to deliver the services and to provide for the infrastructural and program needs, that is where we do have a deficit, and that will take money to solve it. But that's where tracking comes in, because if we have a better sense of where those areas are lacking, then we can allocate for them. Now we just have a sense of it. We just have a sense that we don't have enough people working in mental health. We don't have enough social workers. Jamaica has 1/3 of the cohort of social workers that it ought to have. We ought to have 3,000 plus social workers. We have just over 1,000 social workers. That's not an obvious thing that jumps out, or is not going to jump out when you're talking about allocations. But if you're talking about capacity to deliver social services, whether to children or to any other vulnerable population, that's when you come to the capacity deficit. And that will take allocations and money to solve. But it's money that we have to spend. I mean, it's not a question, it's not a luxury, it's not welfare. These are, the building blocks of our country that we're talking about. And again, it's not just about, children are vulnerable. It's that this is quite literally our future. This is our tomorrow. This is our pension.
quite literally.
Yes.
Because of course, if we're below replacement rate and we're not investing in our
Yeah.
children, it means that therefore there may be a gap as it relates to when I get to the point of retirement, there's nobody contributing to that retirement pool, for instance. But it's a serious conversation that we have to have because it's all cross-cutting, and the report shows us that it's multi-sectoral as well, which is why the report highlights 8 key sectors within which we must also take a look at how spending is linked to education and how those funds are flowing.
Javon, I just wanted to say one more thing, which is that, we only looked at the estimates and at the budget. And, as I had said in the outset, we can't come up with a per child number because so much spending happens outside of what we see in the budget. And, part of the research was to engage with the JSIF and the CHASE and the NHT. And they are all spending on children, but they are also not disaggregating and not tracking. And when you ask, it's like, yes, this is something we should be doing. We would like to do this. And so it's not just about putting in the performance expenditure management frameworks. It's also about requiring across government, all MDAs, including the ones that we don't see in the estimates, to also do child-reported spending, condition of communities. That is a crucial area for child development. The quality and conditions of a child's home environment are incredibly important for their development and also for their performance and their ability to learn. So the same thing that we talked about, the expenditure in education, it can't be realized because many of the children aren't able to learn to fulfill their potential and take up all that expenditure and all of that investment. If we could put a dedicated line in or mandate in HAJ, in NHT, beyond just putting in a playground in a community where they're, but how is what this housing project or this community infrastructure project, how are we going to track children's outcomes in this project already? That is something that we can do and that we should do. And when we're talking, and that will also allow us to see if we're going to be shifting, if we're going to take up the recommendation of shifting more resources into the other areas outside of education that matter for education's investment to be realized and for child development more broadly. Those kinds of changes will help us to get to that, to achieve that objective.
Because it's all connected.
Yes.
Andre, one of our audience members are asking, or saying rather, there is a difference between spending in education and investing in children. And they're saying, how can this research help to redirect how we operate to see more results?
An investment is long-term. And it also looks at outcomes that you want to realize. So you put some money down because you have a plan in mind. Spending is a response to something that's happening now. We advocate for strong investments in children because children require long-term prioritization, not just only in the budget, but in all spheres of their development. And so, which is why this report not only speaks to the investments in education, but it covers 7 other sectors which are important. In fact, it's interesting that the thinnest level of expenditure goes toward the first 1,000 days. That is a wonderful point for us to have the conversation, because again, as I said it before, when we make that investment at that point, we will see the returns later on. So it's not just a response to an immediate need. A baby crying, taking that child up is not just the only thing that you do. You have to begin to assess, is there hunger happening? Is the child cranky? Does the child want to sleep? So as a society, we have to take up our children in hand and not just respond to what we see at surface level, but begin to look deep within to see what are those intrinsic and internal needs that exist that we must begin to address. And that's an investment.
This is a whole of society scenario, and we're speaking a lot about a lot of the intricacies that will require government action, yes. But is there a space for consideration for private sector and other stakeholders who are also in this cross-cutting realm, what would you say, based on what you're seeing in the research, the role would be for other stakeholders in helping us to bridge that gap that now exists?
For me, the big takeaway from this report and from this research is that education is important, but there are other things that are also very important that we're not spending enough on. And a lot of pressure comes on government to spend on education. It's a very protected sector. We spend a lot on it, and a lot of pressure is put on the ministry. And there's a lot of disappointment that we are still not getting outcomes. We're putting in so much money, we're putting in so much investment, so much effort, and we're still not getting the outcomes. Our productivity levels are still extremely low. We're not seeing the human capital development that we would expect to see. And this is we have been putting money into education for a long time. So for me, the implication for private sector and also for interested Jamaicans who want to know where they need to start lobbying and start putting pressure on decision makers is we need to start putting more money into the areas, the sectors, the programs, the interventions that come before children go to school, and not just early childhood education, into the things that are, the Brain Builder program, but Brain Builder program that is going to start from early. So taking the examples and the lessons from the same Reach Up Jamaica intervention, it's not just parenting workshops, it's targeted interventions to teach mothers, not just the ones who are going to show up at the parenting workshop. Those ones you don't even need to worry about. It's always something that amuses me about our insistence on parenting training. The ones who come to the training, they're by definition already going to be okay. But that program was a home visit program. It went to visit people in their homes. You didn't have to opt in to show up. But we need to be thinking more about how we are reaching the very youngest ones who have the greatest needs. And many of those needs, we already know them. We do have data indicating where the needs are. What we don't have the data is showing how we are actually targeting those needs by putting spending where we would like it to go. And that is where the accountability frameworks and the measurement frameworks come in, in the system design of these interventions. So for me, the biggest takeaway for the private sector is, yes, education is important, but these are the areas that you, whether in your corporate social responsibility, your philanthropy, also need to be investing in the areas that are not as obvious, because it's very easy to build a computer lab or, contribute to a new roof on a school, and these are important things. But there's other areas where their spending is needed, both by government and by private sector.
Andre, did you want to add anything to that?
Every dollar has a story behind it. Whether it's having to find money for a taxi fare, or to buy a meal, or to go to the supermarket. And it's important, when I sit at my desk, I think about how does this number contribute to somebody else's life. And I say to myself, dear 5-year-old Andre, what did you need that I can provide today that would have made your life better then? And it behoves all of us sitting in this room and online to ask ourselves the question, are you a policymaker? Does your number transform somebody else's life? That $1 that we allocate toward school feeding program, toward PATH, toward the school bus program, whatever it is, mental health, it goes a mighty long way. And so we need to begin to track, where does that $1 go? Like a leaf that goes down a gully filled with water, we need to track where that $1 goes to see and ensure that it reaches every single child.
I mean, we could spend the entire evening just having this discussion based on all of the findings from the report. And I do know that there may be a few questions in the audience. While we have a few of them on Slido, however, I'm going to take those, and in the event that there are potentially any questions in the audience, we may be able to take one, but we're encouraging you to use the Slido. I see here another question: what factors have influenced or may influence government's willingness to improve accountability and implement meaningful policies and programs. I'm going to put that one to you, Dr. Thorburn. Based on your own research over the years and even putting together this body of work, what do you see as factors that have influenced or may influence a government's willingness to improve accountability and implement these meaningful policies / programs?
So when we talk about, government's willingness, we have to think about there's the politicians, the elected officials who want to get reelected. Then there's also the bureaucracy. There are two very different layers of government. And so I think we need to think about, well, who are we trying to reach? Who are we trying to convince? Politicians, I would say, and this is based on research not only on this, but on so many of the other things that we've done over the years, they're convinced when you can present something to them that is not too difficult to do and will have a visible, tangible outturn. So this is something that they can campaign on. And it needs to not be too difficult to do because they need to be able to do it in that electoral cycle. And I would say this qualifies. This is something that I think is an easy sell. I don't think it's as easy a sell as to the people who would then have to be doing it. Holding people accountable, putting in accountability frameworks is more work for people. It is. Jamaica is a low productivity country, and we're low productivity across the board in our private sector and in our public sector. That's been a topic of the public discourse recently, is the productivity of the public sector. Putting in accountability measures in private sector or public sector is going to force people to produce results.
Which is critical.
Yes. So for me, that would be the nut that needs to be cracked.
All right, so I think I have about 10 seconds, but Andre, your closing words here.
I'll use what a youth advocate said to me. We want to see the numbers match the words. I'll end right there.
Any other short phrase you want to leave, Dr. Thorburn?
It's up to us as citizens to hold our government and our civil servants accountable.
Well, with that said, ladies and gentlemen, it has been a very insightful evening of discussion. And remember, of course, to ensure that you check out the Capri social media platform as well as the Capri website where you'll be able to find the report. Also ensure that you're following UNICEF online and you're engaging with UNICEF. Of course, they're the ones who commissioned Capri to get this report done. So, room for improvement. The gap between public spending and child outcomes in Jamaica. We thank you so very much for being with us here this evening, ladies and gentlemen. For those online, we thank you as well. And of course, keep the conversation going wherever you are. Until next time, my name is Javon Keys. It's been a distinct pleasure being with you this evening. And of course, please ensure that you are taking your own steps in your own spaces to keep the conversation running on this important. Thank you so very much.